How much influence did your mother have on you being a politician?
Well, she was very proud. She wanted my father to be, but then with me, she was very proud, especially I became governor. You see, my father was he was the head of the House of Assembly, where BJ was in the House of Council. And so when my father died, there was a vacuum. It was the Popular Party and the Territorial Party. That motivated me to pursue what he pursued. He didn't run for governor because at that time, governors are appointed by the President of the United States. It was Navy-owned. And so I ran as a territorial. And it was the Territorial Party was just starting. And I think they've lost one election. And so then I joined them. And to everybody's surprise at that time, I guess, we won the majority. And I was the chairman of Finance and Taxation. But first of all, it was Camacho that was, he was an appointee, Carlos Camacho, the father of Felix. It was appointed by the President of the United States. But then it became, to the Organic Act, I guess, we're able to elect our own governor. And so he ran for governor. And so besides running for the legislature as a territorial, I was also the campaign chairman for Governor Camacho. And we won. We beat Ricky. Then I ran again for the legislature and stayed in the legislature. And at the end of Camacho's administration, I ran against Ricky. And I beat Ricky.
Remember that in those days, Popular Party was the only party. And I remember a lot of pocket meetings, when we go down to the South, there were hardly no people there because there were strong democratic villages. The stories that they bust out the people when we schedule our meeting, and when we go down there, we're only talking to ourselves and a very handful of supporters. But it was fun in those days, and we went through it so many times.
People took politics very seriously then. This is my father's time, not my time, but my father's time. Well, we could not sell our bread beyond, not even in Georgia, the South, because we had Thomas Bakery, and all the South were Democrats. In fact, when we come to Inarhan, the late Commissioner Diego, right? I'll give you an example of what happens then. We come to Inarhan, nobody there, because the commissioner, they're called commissioners then, would take a bus and bus all his people down to the movies. So we're speaking to an empty place, nobody there. So politics is very personal.
Of course, Paul in those days was, the star. And I just watched and listened. And then in 1964, it was split. A few of the members of the Popular Party put up another party, which is called the Territorial Party. And that's only a handful of people. But they were able to win one election in 1964. But they obviously lost the following year, but in 1966. And in 1970, they won majority in the legislative seats, and in 1972, again won. And he was always the top vote getter. That's how I got to know him, was in 1972, when I ran for an office in the legislature.
First time?
First time, 1972. And of course, Paul and I became close as a result of our political career. When I first started out in politics, that's how I got to know Paul. He's a very nice fellow, very optimistic person. He's very confident and well-liked, charismatic person. When the governor ran for governor, the second time around, he asked me to be his running mate.
I remember in November of 1978, when Governor Calvo was elected governor and Joanna, now former governor, then a senator, was elected lieutenant governor. And we were partying just a few blocks over here in Agania, and it was raucous. We were having so much fun and yelling, and KOM was there recording it, and it was a tremendous time. And that's when I was really just jumping into politics. I didn't go head first into the water until maybe 82 or something like that during Ben Blas's initial campaign. But I'd always been a Republican. You know, my grandfather was one of the founders of the party here, along with Governor Camacho, Lieutenant Governor Kurt Moylan, Judge Regis. And then the others slowly made their way over to the National Party. That included Governor Calvo, who was then a senator. So I was happy to see when he was elected governor. I remember when he was elected governor. I remember when he won the nomination to run again. I remember the riding candidacy of 1974 and being up in the compound, and they were talking about having a write-in, and no, let's not do it. And the crowd said, no, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. So they had a write-in. And of course, it wasn't successful, but it was still very spirited, and that's democracy. And politics is the essence of democracy. And when you sit down and we all talk politics with the elder statesmen, if I may call you that, Governor, they know so much more. People like me, I just coached. People like Governor Calvo got in the arena with a sword and went at it with the other guys, and you have to respect him for that. I respect all people who run, whether they win or they lose, because they've thrown their hat into the arena as opposed to sitting in the armchair and looking backwards 2020.
How is it that you became chief of staff for Governor Paul Calvo?
When I came in, Matt Lonek was already his chief of staff. I worked under Matt Lonek, and we actually had a good working relationship. He saw things from a different perspective, which was necessary. It was only after he resigned then I went up and assumed the position of the chief of staff. Nevertheless, it was a very challenging time when I came in, because so many issues that involved the government, and much to probably the amazement of a lot of people, we had a very small staff compared to, even subsequent governors. When I became chief of staff, we only had like 27 people on board. He was coming in from the private sector. So it was a whole different mode of thinking, which was good, because I believe that that's what Guam needed at the time. From that, the government run from the perspective of a business entity, and certainly Paul Calvo was that. And his policies that he implemented or that he proposed reflected that. And but you still need government professionals to be able to carry on or to implement just the day-to-day functions of government, providing for the basic services to the people. In addition to coming up with the different initiatives that are long-term. But I was very blessed that when working for Paul Calvo as his chief of staff, I was the youngest ever selected, appointed. I think I was only 27.
What was the first thing you had to do?
Well, the one that was very major at the time was the political status, the issue of political status. Of course, always the issue of economic development, expanding our base. His thinking was very forward-thinking in that. But also infrastructure, improving government services, the level of government services and the quality of government services to people. That was always paramount. But there were all these other issues that would always come up, whether... It doesn't matter which governor, they always do. And so, the staff had to be prepared to be able to, and the governor had to be prepared to deal with them. The governor makes the final decision, but it was my job to be able to give him all the information that he needs, pro and con, for him to make a decision. My job also, at the end of the day, after he makes the decision, is to implement the policy. And that's what I did. The team that he assembled was very qualified. Well qualified. And we were just very fortunate, that we had that quality of caliber of people that worked for him. Although it was small, we still did a lot of things.
You mentioned the paper deficit.
There is a real cash deficit But there's also a paper deficit, which includes the cash deficit. But one of the first jobs I ever had, I was assigned to when I first got in there, was to really make a determination of what is the deficit. Because throughout the history of the legislature and every administration, the executive branch and legislative branch, all these appropriations were made. In reviewing all of them, and I went back to, God, I think I even gave up going back after so many years, because it was just like the records weren't even existent. When you had to go back to the first legislature. But anyway, there were these projects, capital projects, that the legislature would pass an appropriation for, yet we never had any funds to fund these. So they would just stack up. And that's what happened. And so at the end of 5 years or whatever, you're facing with all these, and then you're looking, people say, well, there's got a $20 million deficit. Wait a minute. Out of that $20 million, there's $15 million that, these appropriations that people don't even bother with anymore, but they're still on the books. So I had to identify those appropriations and send over, develop a legislation that would de-appropriate. So the governor transmitted that to the legislature, and of course created a lot of problems, because when mayors and other elected officials said, wait a minute, you can't touch our project and all this, even though the project has never been implemented for 15 years, but still we had to contend with that. So finally the legislature did authorize the passage or the appropriation, and then we were able to get through to language that after so many years of an appropriation being made, that it would be automatically de-appropriated. Paul should really be credited for, because not just the fact that we did have to make the hard decisions on de-appropriating projects, but also develop a procedure for an automatic de-appropriation, so that other governors and legislators would not be faced with the same problem. Because the one thing that they will do is just leave it on the books, which adds to the deficit. So, there had to be a procedure or process in place to automatically de-appropriate this.
So how did self-determination become a concern in the Calvo administration?
In the time when the governor took office, there was already a contentious, not a conflict, but there were differences of opinion with the federal government and the government of Guam with respect to moving forward, and primarily on economic development, things that are very critical to the development process of Guam.
One of the reasons why back then we were moving towards a status in those days was that the U.S. government, federal government, has been very inconsistent in their ruling with respect to our economic potential policies. We had some garment industry forming, watch industry forming, and then the feds would come and change the policies, and we would lose those industries.
And I remember we wanted to get rid of that Jones Act, which we're still saddled with, but we had to find a way to be able to get around that if Congress didn't want to move in it. Then we had to figure out a way on circumventing it without really violating the law. But, it took a long time.
Was Paul Calvo the first to put political status and self-determination on the political agenda?
Yes, because he was the first one to legally organize a commission to be able to concentrate solely on the issue of political status. And that's what brought it up, elevated to the forefront.
It was during his time that it started. He signed the bill 417 creating the Commission on Self-Determination on May 1980. He was very passionate in our political status in Denver when he was a member of the legislature, and then when he became a governor.
What was his motivation for doing it?
He was one elected leader who saw the need that people of Guam were never exercised their self-determination. So it was really a question of being a patriot, to Guam. We had always talked about it since, and that's why we really focused on the political status question.
What was your role in all that, George?
Writing the executive order which established the commission formally and legally, And then I was the first interim director of the commission until the commission was able to hire somebody else.
What was it like to serve in the Paul Calvo administration?
It was very nice. I enjoyed serving with him because he has a passion of trying to improve the economy of Guam.
Economic development is critical to our political development. You know, you can't develop politically without having a firm foundation economically. You know, and these economic issues have to be addressed in order to provide, because if we're looking at existing on our own, Guam, then we better have a solid economic foundation. You know, because the last thing we need is to be continue to be dependent on another. You know, we're just going to replace the U.S. with another. You know, doesn't make any sense.
It was very critical that the Navy have not relocated the ammunition wharf at Cabers Island, and he spent a lot of time with the federal government to get the Navy to move it, because as long as the ammunition wharf is at Cabers Island, the commercial port cannot expand, cannot improve the facilities. We can develop our economic potential. We can invite fishing fleet to home port and use the commercial port as transshipment point, R&R for provision and so forth. You know, and that's a big industry. So he was able to get the Navy to build their own ammunition wharf at Roti Point. That free up now the Cabers Island as well, and we can improve and be out of danger because it's within the explosive zone and it's very risky. That's one of the reasons why it's hard to develop the port.
Another topic that I'd like you to touch on is the negotiations that the governor had with the Navy.
Oh, yeah.
Taking over commercial port. Can you describe how that came about?
Up until the security clearance was lifted on Guam, that was in the early 60s, I believe, that everything, air transportation, surface transportation, the ports were controlled by the Navy. The U.S. Navy had the NAS, and you know, we had a consulate for our airport, our terminal, and then of course the port was right down there, where the existing port is, but in a much smaller area. But you know, it had to coexist with the Navy's own. When you think about it, they own it, they operate it, so the priority is going to be on the military side, not for the civilian side, and that simply cannot work. If we're looking at developing our own infrastructure, which is critical for the economic development of Guam, our ports and airports, we have to control it. There's just no way. You need a port that is owned by the government, the people of Guam, that would just cater or to be for the benefit of the local population. Nobody else, because we have a different objective in mind. Ours was not military for defense or anything like that. Ours was for supply of civilian goods to a civilian community. But in essence, also be able to set up the infrastructure for future growth, future expansion of port facilities, which is what happened. That has been ongoing, you know, since even back in after Governor Calvo's administration.
What negotiations did the governor enter in with the Navy for that?
Well, was for the Navy to be able to relinquish control and the assets of the port and also the surrounding area. So, because we were able to acquire additional land around surrounding the port for future development, you know, and which was necessary because this is just planning for the future. We weren't going to build these, you know, humongous facilities and then not be stuck with them. No, we needed it for continued growth, and which was the right approach to take. But we just needed to make sure that we had the space available, the land area that's required for that kind of development.
So where did the Navy go?
They went right across. They had their own Apra Harbor, which went all the way around. It started from the mouth, from one end of Apra Harbor, all the way down to the other side. You stand on the Port Authority today and look across, there's Navy's wharf. When the decision was made by the Navy that they were going to relocate, the first thing they had to do was find whether there was an alternative site to their existing and any proposed facilities that they thought of. So they did take a look at other areas of Guam. Those were ruled out by the Navy, which was good. because it would have been too much of a controversy between the Department of Defense and the government of Guam and the people of Guam. So they decided to just proceed in developing from one end of Apra Harbor for their ammunition wharf and for their other wharf areas they would use strictly for the military, and all the way down to Orodi Point. For them, it was actually most logical because they already owned the property, so they wouldn't have to acquire any additional property. They knew they needed the facilities. It's just that they couldn't be located in the same place the government of Guam, the Port Authority, was located.
And then he was also the one that started again to ask the military to return about 400 acres back of the property at the commercial port at Cabras Island. And he was able to get it back.
Are you talking about the glass breakwater?
All the way. Because they own a lot of Cabras Island. They still have it back then. And so the Navy was holding it. So we weren't able to develop Cabras Island. We were only using the small limited area for the commercial port, and we need to expand the container yard, the fishing industry related facilities there, and other light industry warehouses. So he was very successful in getting that thing done.
The Navy returned not just from the tip of the glass Cabras breakwater, just follow the curve of the bay and all the property inland, up to the road, the highway. And it encompassed not just the port facilities, but also additional property behind the port to be developed as an industrial park. And then also behind the port where the fuel tanks are now, the Cabras power plant, that used to be Navy. And then further on down to the inner harbor, to where the ski beach, that area, and then that would close up. But in that property contains infrastructure for fuel oil pipelines. There's different infrastructure that are critical to port operations.
And that all happened in when?
That was half started actually during Governor Calvo's administration. As far as I can remember, not all of it was completed, but that's okay. Because, the key is to get it started, get them to agree, and Guam benefits, yeah.
And the other thing he did also was engage the Navy to terminate the Power Agreement. We worked towards the termination of the Power Agreement. And the reason for that is that the Navy was not paying their costs. The government of Guam is paying much of the cost for the production of the power. And that the Navy weren't improving the system as well. And there's no investment in building an additional power plant. And that's hurting our economy also because we're trying to build our potential economic activities. So, you can invite industry here. You can build additional hotels if you don't have adequate power, reliable power. In those there were a lot of power outages. So as a result of it, the Navy finally increased their share of the Power Agreement, and then we finally took over the system. We had a long negotiation because we had to also, we can understand the concern that if we take over, that we have good management in place and so forth.
Because they were susceptible.
Yeah, because it's military interest again, and we understand that. And so we have to develop those trusts, and we have to bring in good, very competent people to run the power facility. So that allows us to grow and build new power plants and be in a position to adequately provide for any economic development. So those are very good points that the governor had fought back then and won.
There were also not just the shipping, the surface shipping, but air transportation. Because the Jones Act affected our surface sea transportation, and the airlines, the air routes were being affected by the cabotage rules. So we were just being squeezed on both air and surface.
So you found a way to relieve the shipping problem from the Jones Act. How did you do it for the air service?
Well, we had to go through the federal government, and because whenever they negotiate this air treaties with different countries. We needed to make sure that Guam was in there to be able to, that Guam's position was put forth. I mean, we're just an island of, 32 miles long, 8 miles wide, hardly a dent in anybody's industry. So, we just had to make sure, because whenever the U.S. government were negotiating these treaties, I mean, it was negotiated on the standpoint of their frame of mind was strictly from what's going to benefit the continental United States. And that doesn't necessarily apply to Guam. During Paul Calvo's administration, we began that. We began this really concerted effort. And we even had some people with the Department of Commerce. There were also individuals that were heavily involved in that had good relationships with the federal agencies that we had working on that, so that it was just a question of convincing the people who did the actual negotiation of what Guam's position was and why it was important. And they 9 times out of 10 they had no problem with it.
So how did you relieve that?
Well, first of all, they opened additional gateways which included Guam, and then take Japan for instance. They added on not just additional flights, but also gateway cities. So that way we had more travel that could be coming into Guam from different areas. It applied also to Hong Kong, even to the Philippines, and all over, throughout Asia. So the foundation was set for even future growth, and that's really what we were looking at. The tourism industry was just starting, was just developing. We were looking at transportation, surface transportation, Guam being a transshipment point. Then also for the air, and make it so that we have more airlines that would be capable. Would be capacity to service Guam from more airlines rather than just a few. When the governor first took office, the Guam, the airport, the actual airport, had just opened. And when it opened, it was already obsolete. I don't know if you remember the old airport. Went from a Quonset hut to a concrete building, but where the old terminal is now, that was the Guam International Airport. And then it was just too small. So we started planning on the development of a new facility, an international terminal with, I believe at that time it was only like 7 or 8 gateways. I can't really remember the exact number, but it was even less than what we have now. What we have now is the result of subsequent development. But the original improvement to the old airport, where the new airport was constructed, actually occurred during the Calvo administration. We're doing all the promotions for developing our tourism industry, yet we don't have the facilities, the infrastructure to service them. And so, it had to go hand in hand. Sometimes you need to have the infrastructure there in place before you start developing. But, we just decided, look, Guam is already, we know where we're going. This has been set. So it's just a question of getting the agreements in place. And, because we had to have the physical infrastructure to accommodate any increased air traffic. So that's what happened.
What about the other parts of the infrastructure, like the sewer and the roads?
Well, the roads, we had, the Federal Highway Administration was already improving a lot of the primary roads. So that was on track. The problem was on the secondary roads, which is inside the villages. So there was a proposal that came down to the governor with an idea, because we wanted to do something for the villages. Improve infrastructure, that kind of thing. But particularly roads, and because the road was terrible, roads were terrible. So what happened was there was the director of public works at that time brought down his engineer. We had a meeting with the governor and said, well, they figured a way to reduce the cost substantially, rather than building a new road, secondary road, resurface the old one. And we said, so they made their pitch, and the governor liked it, and everything was. And we just said, okay, and we were able to fund that on incrementally, rather than trying to fund an entire project, island-wide project.
The other thing I liked about what he did was he built a lot of paved roads in the villages. Because in those days, it's so rough, inadequate. And so he started building a lot of paved roads. And in the southern also, he built some of the paved road in the villages.
Although we implemented it way before the election, it became a political issue. Well, because the people that were working in the, down at the front lines were actually, when they paved, they would pave driveways or, in some cases, parking lots. And when it first came to our attention, that was absolutely, we didn't want that to begin with, because it was a good program, and it just got, tainted by that, which was so sad, because it did benefit a lot of people, notwithstanding the issues. But a lot of and they're still around. The roads are still there, and I could see going through some of the villages. Hey, that's a road that that's a Governor Calvo's road.
Why was it politicized?
Well, because the people down the teams that were working at the village level, they started saying, well, let's pave this road and skip this other road because, whoever lived there. And
whoever lived there? What?
Well, whether, they became Democrat or Republican. So obviously, naturally, and, I just said, that's not right, period. It should never have been done that way. But, obviously, we could not, there wasn't any control from the top. Although we did give the orders, the governor gave the orders, no, that is not to be done. It was still happening. And there was, a breakdown, obviously, and that's where, it actually broke down. But it was actually a good program, notwithstanding all these problems. But, and people still talk about it today.
The good roads.
Yeah, the good roads.
Paul doesn't have any pretense, right? He is what he is. And he's not one who intimidates. So he was a good governor. And truly, I've never, if there's anything I remember about Paul Calvo, he's a great campaigner. He loves to campaign. He loves meeting people. If I wanted to stay a politician, I want to be like Paul Calvo. But Paul was a hard worker. And he was genuine also. He wasn't aloof, and he works very hard at campaigning. One thing that you remember about Paul, man, he's always out there. Spends a lot of time on the campaign trail.
One of the other things that came up in the campaign for Paul Calvo's re-election was road paving. Do you remember that?
Yes, that was a big, thing. Those side roads were just really in gross disrepair.
So why did it become a negative issue for his campaign?
Oh, because, if you pave my road, man, I'll vote for you. So that's a lot of votes. From the governor's standpoint, he's doing something good for the people. From the opposition's point of view, you are upsetting the apple cart because you're doing this for their vote. So,
But as it turned out, though, that road paving did a lot, because in a lot of the places in the boony areas, they paved things. And if they hadn't done that, people would still be wallowing in mud to this day, But unfortunately, that road paving was his undoing, because the Guam Cable was relentless in its campaign against it. It was pounding this thing every night. Lee Holmes was doing this, and I think that the campaign people did not address that. They did not go to Lee Holmes to convince him that, about the worthiness of the project. And there were people whose areas were being paved, and when the cable came around, they were chasing away with weapons and get off my property and all that sort of thing. Eventually, it turned out to be a very good thing for a lot of people. Because I remember very distinctly people from south who were in the Boone areas, and they had no roads. And one day, a bunch of them, they went into their mud piles and with their shoes and all that, and then they went down to the office and brought all that into the governor's office and to demonstrate their problem. And this was one way for them to get the governor to respond to their needs. And he did in a lot of areas like that, as I said. Eventually, was very useful,
But more importantly, he also included sewer system to preserve our water aquifer in the northern Guam. Well, this story started. We had funding from the federal government, and I was actually involved in that when I was Deputy Director of Public Works. Governor Camacho at that time appointed me as chairman of the Guam Water Pollution Control Commission in those days, which is now EPA. And we were supposed to come out with a sewer master plan for Guam because we didn't have any sewer. And in order for us to get federal funding, we have to have a master plan. And we only had a staff of about 3. And one of them, Dr. Natarajan, I'll never forget that guy because he was very good. He was the one that developed it. So we went through that process, and we had to have public hearing. And I'll never forget because we'll have public hearing. Nobody was there. Only one person I remember that came to that public hearing was Giro Cardo Salas. Only him. And so we had no problem passing, where to put the outfall, where to start laying the sewer, the treatment plant, and so forth. We had no problem doing that. I mean, we went through the process and we approved it, and it was then that we started getting federal funds. Those are kind of memories that you don't forget because who would think that a sewer master plan would make a difference? Because fast forward during my administration, it helped me because it's already in place.
Not too many people know this, but environmentally we were able to, we didn't solve all the problems of the environment. We were working on the ordinance. That was like back then. It became so mired in politics. It happened during Paul Calvo's administration where we were being cited by US EPA for environmental concerns of order. Yet we were, back then, we were looking for a place, another site. But it was always hitting that political NIMBY wall. And frankly, they were trying to close that. We've been trying to close that down for 20, 30 years. I mean, we had the money from Interior since 1978.
How much?
At that time, it was only $4 million. In those dollars now, ballooned up to hundreds. We figured out that during Paul's administration, that in order to fix the schools structurally, we would only require $15 million. $15 million. Now, they're putting out a contract, and they're not even going to fix all the schools structurally. I mean, the needed repairs, $100 million. In order to have the hotels developed, you have to have, first sufficient water and sufficient treatment of any of the sewage. The last thing we wanted to do was undersize these sewage improvements so that you would have constant overflows and that kind of thing, which did happen actually, because it just overwhelmed the system. There were spills and that kind of, and which was, bad for the environment, bad for people, and so we needed to get that resolved. Building a sewage treatment plant is not, you just don't do it in 30 days. It takes planning, it takes engineering, and it takes a while to construct. So, we knew that when we started, whichever project we started, would not be done until after we left office, which is okay. because that's what it is. That's how it should be. Although I think there was such rapid growth during a short period of time that it obviously overwhelmed the system, and in some cases caused spills and environmental issues. Then, of course, subsequent administrations did upgrade the facilities, and also I think what actually helped in one way, and it was actually a blessing, because there was a pause in the hotel tourism development, hotel construction of several years. So that allowed the government to properly assess and adequately plan for future, because it wasn't going to remain stagnant. I mean, we were also, during Paul Calvo's, that's the one thing we needed to do was to restart the tourism industry.
What caused the slowdown?
Well, the Japanese economy. There was a crash in Japan. They had their economy there went down, and of course we were so dependent on the Japanese that it affected us. But during that period of time, all the hotels had been owned by the Japanese, corporations, Japanese companies. What the government decided to do was just target a specific hotel operation to be able to serve as a catalyst for other hotel development. Other companies that were just sitting on the sideline to see what's happening. So we went after the Nauru, Republic of Nauru owned property there on Guam, and we spoke to we even sent trade missions, seeing the president of Nauru. He came to Guam, the governor met with him, and just doing really trying to get him to agree to develop. And it worked out. It turned out that he did, and he made the commitment. This was before the election, and I'll never forget, because we were having dinner at the government house when the president of Nauru came in, and I remember him telling the governor that he had made a commitment to the governor that he was going to proceed with building a hotel. And he told the governor, he says, although the election didn't turn out the way, he didn't win, but he made a commitment and he was going to follow through with it, and that's fine, because that was what we were looking at. So what happened was the Republic of Nauru, the Pacific Star Hotel, was built and dedicated a year, 2 years after Paul left office. But in that period of time, all these other hotels started their own construction, started their development, and fueled the second boom, a tourism boom in Guam. So what the governor's vision was in how to restart the industry development, actually came to fruition. He did it by focusing on one, and then it's like when, you build it and they will come. And that's exactly what happened.
And look at it today.
Yeah, today, there's a lot of growth, and I don't even know whether they could accommodate more. But, of course, spreading it to other areas has always been on the forefront of consideration. But then you have other, issues that would be involved in that, like with, developing in the South, for instance, and, it's very difficult. So whether the tourism industry development would be confined to specific areas, I think that's the issue that would be probably the next challenge.
What was the greatest controversy that you remember in your first term?
The teacher strike, because I don't like to get angry, even though I do get angry sometimes. But that brought about a lot of tensions on me, the teacher strike, and thank God. I've got people that were very helpful, but there was about maybe 4 or 5 people definitely that were very much instrumental in helping me to calm down the strike. And I remember that at one time I was leaving Government House, and they blocked it. So I jumped up. Normally, the cops do all those things. I went over and I jumped on top of the hood to get it. I said, "What do you guys want?" I forgot everything that was turnabout, but then they cleared up to let me out. That was the platform to talk to them.
Well, what triggered the teachers' strike was this whole issue of pay. And I recall that the legislature had passed a bill that would raise salaries of not just senators, but also certain, cabinet members. And I remember discussing with the governor, that the ramifications of that. And although, we certainly would want to look at the salary ranges, because they hadn't been raised, for a long time. But the question was timing, on whether we could afford it or not. And in my meetings with our budget people, BBMR, as well as our other finance directors, we just couldn't afford it. And it would have not just bankrupted the government, but really shut it down. Our position was we just couldn't afford it at this time. It doesn't mean that we're opposing it, but right now we can't. And so the union and the members decided, well, they wanted it or not. That was it. There was no other position. And so there is a law which applies to strikes against the government by government employees, and which is essentially the framework that we looked at and we're using, so we're making sure that everything we do was within the law. And so when the decision was made by the union to call the strike, we had no alternative except to follow the law to make sure that the government kept running. So that's what happened. The result was, of course, prolonged, lengthy strike. The people were getting terminated in the government that were on strike, and that's probably the worst. It's a terrible feeling. Having to, if you're going to make a decision that affects the livelihoods or lives of people and their families. It's really difficult. But on the one hand, we just couldn't do it. Sometimes I think, well, were we able to communicate that effectively prior to the strike, to prevent a strike and then continue the negotiations? And that's the one thing the question that I've always asked myself. Could we have done something different? And, of course, that's already it's history, and, but it's something that I would never want to go through that again.
How many people were terminated?
Oh, gosh. Definitely over 3,000. Most of them from DOE. But we had others from other agencies. So, and, a lot of these people were my friends, too, and so watch them picketing and all that, and, I just feel very badly about it because, they had their position, and I recognize and respect them. Of course, when it came down to entering into negotiations again to end the strike, we did meet with them, the union officials, and we came to an agreement. Everybody that had been let go would be reinstated. And there were some obviously that didn't want to come back. But that's one of the problems we had to deal with. But in the interim, we still had to keep the government running, the schools operating, kids educated. So we immediately went out, recruited on a temporary basis, particularly the retired teachers, retired government employees, to come back in, because that's the only pool we had. Then when that was exhausted, we had to go outside from that retired pool who had the experience and credentials. And then that's when there were problems that occurred. We foresaw that there could have been, we didn't want it to happen, but it did happen.
Like what?
Well, like substitute teachers were being hired that really had no teaching credentials. And it became very dangerous to be able to put them in the classrooms, because that the kids aren't going to be learning anything. So that's why we needed to make sure that we, at least from a teaching standpoint, we got the retired teachers, as many as we could. And of course, obviously, we didn't have enough. The same with other agency employees. We were also we had that pool. We already had a pool of retirees that were identified prior to, because we just didn't want to call it, fire everybody and not have anything in place. So that's what happened. We had a plan already, a backup plan, which hoping that we would never want implemented, but we had to.
That must have been very, very difficult for you.
It was. I mean, I remember I was in my office and the director of education came in, and literally we were working to try and come up with some remedy to prevent what was a catastrophic event. And there was just no way. I mean, impossible, because the positions were already entrenched. It got very emotional. I mean, because we thought about the families that would be affected, employees and their families, and then the services to be impacted. And we had to identify really where we were going to be lacking, and where we needed to make sure so that the government kept running. And that was the responsibility of the governor.
Who was the director at the time?
Catherine Uggan.
When you said it even got emotional, what happened?
She was very passionate, and her passion was really reflected in her arguing for her position. But at the same time, I recognized that her position, I empathized with it, but I had to think of the governor's position. Guam is small. Everybody knows everybody. And so, there isn't a person that you didn't know, that I didn't know, that was affected one way or the other. I have close friends and relatives marching in the picket lines, and I've felt, there's nothing worse. That's probably one of the worst feelings that I ever had, was, having to make a decision that adversely impacted so many lives.
What about the governor? What was he like at that time?
He was very, he felt the same. He was always asking me, what are the options? Short of this drastic step. And he wanted to make sure everything was, we looked at everything, we explored everything, and obviously, he had to make the final decision. And my job was to implement it, his decision. And I know he was very torn about it, because we spent long hours discussing it, just going over everything, just going over what the effects would be, how are we going to mitigate them, if it came to that. So he was very torn also. He knew all the people, that would be affected. So, and it wasn't just the government, it affected private businesses too. People don't have money to go out and buy things, and businesses can't operate. It was a ripple effect. And in hindsight, I don't think there was anything anybody could do, really, when it came down to it. You were faced with this decision that you didn't want to make, but the consequences of not making it, you had to judge which was more dire. But before he actually made the decision, we both thought about it. Very difficult time to sleep. The next morning, we met. We had a meeting scheduled already, and we discussed it again. Went through it. He wanted to know what exactly the procedures were and how many people would be affected. And, which was at that time we didn't know, but it was quite a bit, quite a few. That lasted because don't forget, we were already looking at all these before that day. It was just like, has anything changed? Is there anything that, any promise or any hope of salvaging this? And, the deadlines were already imposed.
Bring me to the moment.
We looked at each other, and he just told me, I asked him, I said, "Go. You need to make a decision," and he just said, "Well, go ahead." That was it. And of course the downside of it politically was it did affect the governor's re-election. And he knew that, and we all discussed it, but he just had to do what needed to be done, as much as he didn't want to.
you go even today and you want to talk to people who know something about politics and get advice, it was the same then. And one of the people you would try to talk to all the time was Governor Calvo, because you just knew it. He just knew so much about politics. He just knew so much about what the voters want, who the voters were. Governor Calvo is one of those guys one of those people who can see you and hadn't seen you in 10 years, and he'll know exactly who you are. He remembers. And yeah, that's a great gift for a politician. He was a politician.
My father was approached because it was determined that Joe Adams might not run again for re-election with Paul Calvo, whether I would consider the position of running as lieutenant governor. I considered it because I like Paul, and I found him to be straight, and I found him to be honest, and I found him to, harbor some of the same values I was brought up with, And so I decided to do it. And I'll tell you, it was not only rewarding, it was a wonderful experience in my life running with Paul Calvo, because we traversed the whole island. We went to every single village. We met, or at least for me, I met so many people. And, it was an experience that I would suspect that most people will never have. And the whole time, Paul was always there. He goes, "Pete, I think, you need to go up to Dedido." So I'd go up to Dedido. They used to tease me because said, "You got to work harder, Pete." I said, "Are you kidding? I'm out every day." I was young. But you know what? Paul was young too. He was in his, couldn't have been, more in his mid-40s, 44, 45, So we roll into a village, and as we usually do, we kind of split up. But people see us, right? They're talking and everything else. So this lady comes up to me. She goes, "Hey, Pete." I go, "Yeah." "Is that your dad?" I said, "Who?" She goes, "The guy over there. It's Paul Calvo." Oh, I not in front of her, but I had to suppress it. I couldn't stop laughing inside. And I said, no, that's Paul Calvo. My dad's a little older, and he looks a little different. This happened 40 some years ago. So to this day, as a joke, it's a joke that he and I have continued. We'll be at Payless, of all places, waiting in the checkout lines, and he'll see me and he'll go, "Hey, son." And I go, "Dad, how's things?" We go over, we embrace, say hi, get back in line. He goes through, and of course, all the cashiers are wondering, who the hell is this guy? Is he really Paul Calvo's son? And I've been asked, and I've told him, no. In a way, we had kind of a father-son relationship when we were together in politics some years ago. One episode I'll never forget, and it really touched my late wife. We were in Barrigada. I'll never forget this. And my son Tony was about 3 years old, 4 years old. And he did not want to be at this rally. He kept saying, "I want to go home. I want to do this." And so, Paul and I are walking around. There's several hundred people there. And finally starts crying. And Paul was the guy, not Barbara, not anybody else, not my father, not anyone else, who went up and picked him up and comforted him. Said, "You're going to go home soon, son. But we just need to do some things. Just, kind of bear with us, so to speak, But in a kind of very sweet, fatherly, tone." And so my son Tony calmed down, went back to his mother. We did our thing that night and went home. But Paul had kind of that touch, you know, especially with young people and with kids. He could be a soothing influence. And so I think a lot of people may remember him just for that.
So Pete, what's out on the floor?
Oh, lest we forget, this is from 1982. This is a campaign poster that Paul Calvo and I had. That was a wonderful and rewarding episode in my life, that campaign. And it helped to cement really a lifelong friendship based on nothing more than, you know, mutual respect.
Guam has come a long way in politics from the 1970s to 2000 teens. Remember, we didn't elect our first governor until 1970. Before that, they were appointed, which is how my grandfather got to be governor. And it's so much different. Besides the social media part of it, everything changes in life. You can't, you know, the water keeps flowing down the river. And same thing with Guam. We can't go backwards. We'll never be 1970 again. We'll never be 1920 again. There are more people on the registration roll. But back then it was much more personal. You had pocket meetings that people would actually attend. You would really go door to door canvassing. You would go out to your friends. You would go out to the commissioners. They weren't mayors yet; they were commissioners, and you have to get to know all of them and work with them because Guam was much more tight knit 50 years ago, 40 years ago than it is today. And I think that's the biggest difference. It was just more hand on hand, eyeball to eyeball, as opposed to Facebook. Why was Paul the one who became the politician in the family? I think part of it's because he's personable. He was a very good-looking man. Still is, Gov. Very good-looking man. And you have to want to be that politician. His brother Eddie was a senator for 1 or 2 terms, but he was the one who really wanted to go for the total banana tree. And that's when they had Gun Beach. And I remember the rally down there one time, and the speakers all up there on the stage, we're all in the sand, we're having fun. And, you know, I'm in my 20s, so I'm having a lot of fun. And Governor Calvo gets up there and he sings the song you would expect him to sing, I Did It My Way. And he crooned. He was very, very good at it. And I can still see him up there singing that song.
Paul Calvo was a remarkable politician. I mean, there's, a very generous man, very, a kind man. There's not a place that, or, funeral that he would not attend or he would not go. When he was a candidate and we told him, drop everything, go this, go that, no matter what time of day, he would go. He was, he was tireless in that sense.
Were you happy with your governorship?
I was happy to the extent that I was there, but we didn't have, you cannot compare it to the time that we're here right now. Not only in the competition that was there, because, Ricky Berdalio is one of the tough guys at the time, and but Ricky, I beat Ricky, but then he came back and beat me.
Only, the Democratic Party for decades didn't have anybody else to put up except Ricky. And you wonder why? Why is this so? Why wouldn't anybody else come up and try to displace him? And nobody could. He had a way with people, He was so charismatic that and people just naturally followed him,
So on Guam, what really determines who wins and who loses?
I think it's what you do and how you're perceived in the community, and when you're in, what did you accomplish?